So in this video, let us learn about one of the core features of the language known as functions. Now, function will help you to execute code on demand. A function is a language construct which you don't just have in JavaScript, but also in other programming languages, which basically will allow you to define some code which you can then execute at some later point of time. You define the code in JavaScript like this. So let me define a new function and call it as, so I will say function subscribe to nerdy dev, and then I will say console.log one subscription. Okay, so this is how your function looks like in JavaScript. You use the function keyword, then you use any name for that function. Like I have named my function as subscribe to nerdy dev. For that function, then your function can take something which is called as parameters within the parenthesis. And then you have something called as the function body. So that is marked using curly braces, within which you define some code that will get executed eventually. As I said, the function can have optionally some parameters that you define within this parenthesis. So let us continue. Let me define a function with parenthesis. So I will say function greet subscriber and pass on a name of subscriber, and then I will say console.log thanks name, which will be a dynamic variable because I'm using string interpolation using template strings, which we discussed in the video on strings. Definitely check out the video to understand this in a more constructive manner. So thanks name for your support. Okay, so this is a function with parameters. Now as you can see that you can optionally use parameters name in this case, and you can, but you don't have to. Okay, and you can also return values via the return keyword. So let us discuss that as well. Now the interesting thing is, when you define a function in JavaScript file, the code in there, this code in your functions.js file, as you can see, it doesn't get executed immediately when your script gets first executed. Instead, JavaScript will see that function and registers these functions, which means it stores the function in your memory. It is registering those functions and then storing those functions into the memory. You then execute the function by invoking it, and if that function takes any parameters like the greet subscriber function is taking, you will have to pass them, and then you will be able to invoke the function. If that function takes any parameters, any input, you will have to pass them. So you can have more than one parameter separated by commas. So I can have name as one parameter, then some other parameter, and so on. So you will separate all your parameters of the function using comma separator. Okay, so let me revert back. Now you can have more than one parameters, as I told you. Then the code within the function will get executed with the data that you are providing to your function in form of parameters. Okay, and you can call such a function as often as you want by passing the parameter that it expects to get. Now passing in different parameters, and you can then invoke your functions whenever you want in your code with different parameters. Now if it takes parameters, okay, now every function execution then will run independent from other possible previous executions that you might have had in your code. And the great thing is that this now will give you more flexibility, because till now we were writing the code that always got executed from top to bottom. Okay, till now we were having code that always got executed from top to bottom, as we have seen in our previous videos. Now in this case, when the page gets loaded, and therefore all the code used to run immediately. Now with the functions, we can define the code that should run later, and then we can take those functions and use them in our code when required, and to make sure that they get invoked whenever a specific task needs to be performed by them. So let us define a very simple function to see everything what we learned in action. I will define a function called as add two numbers, and I will pass two numbers as the parameter. So I will say add two numbers, and then we'll pass the number 1 and number 2, and I will use the return keyword to return their sum. So return number 1 plus number 2. Okay, and now we are returning the sum of these two numbers. So we do the required computation for which your function was made in the very first place, and then we'll return the result that is obtained by adding them. Now let us invoke the function by passing the required parameters and collect the result in some variable. So say I will name the variable as result and then invoke the function. So const result add two numbers, pass in two numbers 23, 24, and then I will log the result to the console. So let me try running the file by saying node functions.js, node functions.js, and we get the value as 47. Now sometimes we define function to outsource some code that we want to run multiple times. Instead of copying the same code over and again, you want to write some code once and execute it multiple times, and you do not want to repeat ourselves. We want to strictly adhere to the try principle. Do not repeat yourself. So let us see a case for built-in functions that are provided in JavaScript. Okay, and they are provided to us under the hood within the JavaScript language. So I will use the math object that is defined within the JavaScript land, and I will say console.log. Using the math object, it has a method defined on it called max, and here I can pass a bunch of values to find the maximum value out of those bunch of values that I pass. So 13, 14, 15. Okay, so this is math.max. This is actually a method. We will see what are the differences between method and functions, though they are generally the same. And you can see the max function is taking 3 arguments here. Though you can provide any number of arguments, any bunch of values you can pass to this function, and this will return the maximum value out of those bunch of values. Now let us do 2 more methods which will help us with discuss the utility approach, these utility methods. So I will say math.min, pass some bunch of values, and this will spit out the minimum value out of these bunch of values. So we get 10 here. Now one method that I want to discuss is the parse float method. Console.log parse float, and pass a string here like 20.2323, and let us see what the parse float, the built-in method which takes a number in form of a string, as you can see, and it will return the float representation of the very same number that you pass as an argument to this. So let me run this node functions.js. So this gives us 20.2323 in form of a number representation or float representation. Now to get the integer representation, we can pass the very same string into the parseInt method. So let me copy this, and on line 16 I will change this to parseInt. Now let me try running this again, and now we get 20. Then we also have some built-in methods on date. Let us go briefly over them. So I will say console.log, so some date methods, and I will say console.log date.now. So now is a method that is defined on the date object. Let us run this. So we are getting a very long number. So now this method, what it does is it will basically give you the number of milliseconds since January 1, 1970. Now this is all about the very first video on functions. I know the video did went a bit longer, but we have covered here how we can create our very own functions, and we also discussed a bit about built-in functions. In the next video, we'll discuss about the different ways to declare functions. So I'll see you guys in the very next video. and do not forget to subscribe the channel.